before I introduce my next guest, I just sort of put a bit of context around with the work we're doing with the LTS group and while we've engaged them, and some of what Jaydene will be talking about today. Brian and I have been in discussions around different ways that we can support clients, and we looked at local government as an industry and looked at the program of work that Jaydene will be talking a little bit about today. It's a management support program, so think EAP, but for managers to get support on how to deal with different situations that Andrew might have talked about, situations around, an advice line around recruitment, around everything, people risk that we've all been talking about today. So if you're interested in that program, definitely have a chat to Brian or Jaydene today. But yeah, I did want to welcome Jaydene up to the stage. So Jaydene's a better looking version of Brian. Jaydene's an experienced psychologist and is with a background in industrial and organisational psych. She has a passion for supporting health and wellbeing in others and driving performance of people in teams and organisations. Jade will be talking about some of the support, some of the things that you can do to help support your managers, line managers, supervisors in getting better outcomes for your employees.
Thank you. Today's topic is obviously managing people risk, the importance of upskilling coaching for supervisors and managers. I think this session's very timely as there's been different threads in relation to this topic as we've gone through today. Before I do a deep dive into today's topic, I might just tell you a bit about myself and a bit about us at LTS Group. Now, as a psychologist, many of us hear about clinical psychology, providing one-on-one counselling and support to people. I actually went into organisational psychology because I'm much more interested on the proactive, preventative side of things. I would love a world where we didn't actually need one-on-one psychology support because organisations are doing such a brilliant job at promoting the mental health and wellbeing of their people. Now, I am here today representing the LTS Group. In terms of the LTS Group, we are your integrated health and wellbeing service provider. We work across many different brands, which you can see listed here. In terms of us being based in Victoria, you've possibly come across both NabiNet and AMS Consulting. In terms of the breakdown of our services, we firstly focus on people and employee services. So that's things like our employee assistance programs, our manager assistance program, things like LTS On Demand, which I'll be talking about a little bit more today. So that's more of the one-on-one support within that organisational context. We've then got our workplace services, and this is primarily where myself and our team of organisational psychologists work. We also obviously focus on rehabilitation support services, workplace health and safety, and many other workplace-related domains. We've also got our disability services, which I won't touch on too heavily today, just because that's a whole other scheme and an area of practice. And then finally, we've got our medical specialists related to our IME services there too. Now, I've got some very clear objectives in terms of what I'm hoping to achieve in our session here today. Now, I know we've got a nice mixed bag of people sitting here in the room, and it's been interesting on the break just chatting to some of you and hearing about the different hats that you all wear within the workplace. And I don't think I met one person who only wears one hat, okay? So the good news is today's topic actually relates to pretty much everyone that I've spoken to so far. So some people sitting in the room today are going to be managers, supervisors, team leaders, yourself. Other people are going to be responsible for either supervising others or having some level of input within your organisation in terms of what support mechanisms are put in place for these people in your organisation too. Okay, so what do we want to achieve? Firstly, I want you to understand the critical role that managers and supervisors actually play in the workplace, and specifically when it comes to both physical and psychological claims. We're also going to be looking at, well, where do we go wrong? And I want to hear from you as much as I'm going to be talking to you today. So please don't think this is going to be a 45-minute lecture, because it's actually going to be more of a two-way conversation. I want us to understand the different levels of support and where to focus your attention. I think that Simon did a great job of that model that we had earlier today, looking at the preventative side of things. And that's definitely going to be a theme that I'm carrying through today's discussion. And finally, I want to look at some really practical tools that you can take away with you, okay? So I guess one of the difficulties about a day like today is that these are great concepts in theory, but how do we actually go about putting it into practice? So I want to make sure you know what practical steps you can take following today. All right, so let's start off with the question of why are managers and supervisors so special? Now, in preparation for today's session, I did go and do a bit of research, and there was one study that I found, and it wasn't a small study by any means, but these statistics to me are absolutely ridiculous. All right, so this study found that 69% of employees said that their managers had the greatest impact on their mental health. So this was on par with their partners and the influence that their partners could have. And it actually went above and beyond what they classed doctors and even their therapists, the impact that they could have. All right. That is crazy to think that as a supervisor, as a manager, you can have such a strong influence on the mental health and well-being of your employees. All right. Another study, which is quite consistent and related to this, is that 94% of employees believe that managers should have some responsibility of their well-being, but only around 32% of people actually felt like they were achieving that or they were satisfied with that. Okay, so this is the current status quo. So we know that managers and supervisors are extremely important when it comes to both physical but also mental health well-being in the workplace. So what actually is the role of supervisors when it comes to return to work? Okay, so out of interest, when you think about what you expect from your managers or supervisors, what involvement do you want for them to have when it comes to managing someone's claim? Just scream things out at me. Most of it? Yep. Yep. So some sort of involvement along the whole journey. What else? Absolutely. So having that constant communication, if someone's sick, I just had a member of my team call in sick today. First thing I said was, I'm so sorry to hear that you're unwell. Is there anything I can do for you? And that's not just to happen on the one day that someone's sick, but there's actually that continuity and conversation. So in terms of what we want, firstly, we know that the supervisor is often the first point of contact, okay? We know that a supportive supervisor is actually associated with a greater likelihood of that person returning to work, okay? We know that early contact with the employee has a significant impact on return to work outcomes. And that's especially important if it is a psychological claim, where with that type of injury, someone might be having thoughts of, I'm not wanted, they don't care if I'm there or not, they're not going to accommodate me. There's so many different unhelpful thinking styles that someone with a psychological injury could have that a manager could actually help to challenge some of those thinking patterns. And finally, we know that employees report that employers respond more positively to a physical injury than a psychological one. Who here would agree with that sentiment? Yep, lots of nodding heads, lots of arms up. Absolutely. So, society has come a very, very long way when it comes to perception of mental health and well-being in the workplace. But the reality is there's still a stigma surrounded with mental health claims, and even just some of the language that we've used today, concepts like lazy workers, things like that send us back 10 years, when it comes to thinking about psychological injuries in the workplace. Okay. So where do you think managers or supervisors go wrong? All right, I'm going to give you a few moments in your lines. If everyone could kind of congregate together, I just want for you to do a little bit of a brainstorm. Where do you think managers or supervisors are going wrong when it comes to return to work management? All right, go. All right, I'm going to bring us back. I'm sure we could spend the whole rest of today talking about where managers and supervisors go wrong. Could people just scream out, maybe if I point out your row, if you could just shout out something and try not to repeat what the other row said? What were you screaming out?
We were talking about micromanagement.
Yep, brilliant. What about your row?
Lack of understanding of what systems are and creating in terms of organizations.
Yep, absolutely. What about you?
Two rows. We spoke about a number of things, but the difference is the time that our leaders are just so task-driven as well as people leader focused, and how do they balance that, especially in council land and responding to councillors and dealing with all this change. So they just simply the lack of time.
Yep. Brilliant. So look, I'm going to jump to the next slide where I've got probably a few of the things that you were discussing listed. So I like to break down where I guess managers, supervisors go wrong. And I'm not manager, supervisor hating at all. On the next slide, I'll talk about why they go wrong, because sometimes it can actually be quite systematic and it's not actually their fault. But firstly, in terms of the people management, and we were just talking about kind of the lack of empathy, and the lack of empathy might not be because they don't want to have that empathy or it's not there. The lack of empathy might be they're so bloody burnt out giving empathy to everyone and being empathetic towards everyone, or maybe from their own workload that there's an absence of that empathy. Okay, so that could be a component. Obviously, things like insufficient health promotion. You know, how many times have we seen organizations talk about workplace health and safety when it comes to physical risk in the workplace? And only now, due to a complete shift in legislation, are we finally talking about the shift in psychological risk. We can also see things like people neglecting ergonomics and safety. Lack of health resources, ignoring health signals, maybe stigmatizing mental health discussions, or especially someone taking a mental health day. Even I myself, if I take a mental health day, I still have like this little doubt in my mind to actually call it a mental health day. And I'm an organizational psychologist. You know, if someone feels comfortable doing that, it should probably be me. And also failure to lead by example. You know, how many managers have we seen put their own mental health and well-being, or maybe even their physical well-being, at risk and not actually walking the talk themselves? So that's the people management component. Then we've got the return to work component. And I know that someone over here had a slightly different term, but what we were talking about is really handballing responsibility. You know, how many people here have supervisors or managers who just think, oh, it's the return to work coordinator's job, or the people in culture, or the HR, or whatever hat you're wearing within your organization? There's a perception that that's your job, and the communication that we were talking about before, they feel like that's your job to pick up the phone and call them and see how they're doing and make sure they're attending treatment. That's not my job to do as a manager. And the reality is for everyone to do. You know, that person needs to feel like there's a whole circle of support surrounding them, you know, really wanting for them to get back to work. Insufficient communication, lack of involvement. How many people here have managers or supervisors who attend case conferences? Unheard of. All right. Inadequate planning. You know, how often are we actually having conversations around, all right, what does the return to work plan look like? What are the reasonable adjustments we need to be making? Disregarding people's individual needs, failure to provide duties. I mean, how many times have you banged your head against a brick wall trying to get a manager to identify suitable duties? And this way of thinking of sometimes managers and supervisors, black and white, you know, either they're at work and they're able to do the job and they're able to do it how they used to, or we don't want them back at all. All right. And then also just neglecting, you know, the reintegration process too. Okay. So look, why do managers go wrong? So look, I do have empathy. I'm a manager myself, and I know the challenge sometimes of just trying to do it all. Firstly, there can be an overemphasis on productivity, and we were also touching on that one, I think, in our discussion, where sometimes the focus can be just on the work and the work output, and we don't actually contextualize it, you know, when it comes to the value of mental health, well-being, employee morale, you know, commitment to the organization, staff retention. You know, there's so much more that goes beyond productivity that actually does eventually link in back to the bottom line, you know, how much revenue we're generating, but there's not as direct of a link. And I think that's why we make productivity the number one thing that we focus on. Sometimes there can be a lack of awareness or understanding, you know, especially working in a council area, and I'm an expert, I guess, when it comes to working in councils. Sometimes having maybe an older workforce, maybe there's generational differences in terms of thinking when it comes to workplace health and safety, especially psychological injuries. Sometimes there's just not that same level of understanding, you know, when it comes to mental health and well-being. People can have their own stigma or stereotypes, whether it be due to age, culture, maybe you're working in a regional area where there can be different perceptions there too. Some people have never had role models. I've had the benefit of having managers who have been psychologists themselves. So, of course, conversations around mental health and well-being has been embedded, into our one-on-one discussions. But not everyone's had that luxury. So how do we just expect for people to invent the wheel themselves when they've never actually had someone to role model how to do it? Sometimes people's time and workload, maybe managers know, hey, I should probably pick up the phone and call that person or attend that case conference with them. But sometimes they're struggling themselves with their own workload or maybe absence of, effective resourcing or people to do the job. So, they might be facing those struggles. Sometimes they might not just be trained or have the resources. Just a raise of hands, who here formally runs training for supervisors or managers in return to work practices? All right, not many hands. Good. Pat on the back for those who do. But sometimes this kind of links into our recruitment session that we were running earlier. Sometimes we make an assumption just based on someone's previous work experience that they actually know how to do these things. But embedding training such as that within your organization can actually make sure that there's that consistency across the organization, that everyone knows what best practice return to work looks like, and everyone understands what their responsibilities are in supporting someone in their team around that. And finally, an absence of skills. If we haven't formally trained them in having mental health conversations or physical health conversations or other things, how can we just expect for them to wake up one day and know how to do it and know how to do it in an empathetic manner? So what are the different levels of intervention? And as I said, this links in really well with Simon's slides that he was sharing earlier. So generally speaking, this should all be familiar with you. If not, feel free to do some research or come have a chat to me and Brian after today. Generally speaking, we can break down our interventions into 3 domains. So firstly, we've got our primary interventions, which should really occur before an injury or an illness occurs. We've then got our secondary. So this is once it's occurred, but this aims to minimize it. Now, our LTS on-demand service that we'll be talking about a little bit later today, that's very much a secondary intervention, in that if there is a manager or a supervisor who's having some level of difficulty, but they really want to nip it in the bud before it gets worse, that is a perfect opportunity for people to call up, get some advice and guidance from an appropriate person, and make sure that it doesn't get to a point that they need to be looking at tertiary interventions, which really just tries to halt the progression, of that injury or illness. Out of interest, where do you feel like you focus your attention? So raise of hands primary, raise of hands secondary, raise of hands tertiary. I'm raising my hand because that's what I see from most organizations. Okay, so what should we be doing at each level? So managers and supervisors play a role at all of these levels, okay? So firstly, from a primary perspective, we need to focus on building a positive work culture, all right? And that can be almost like a safe work culture in terms of prioritizing both physical safety, but also psychological safety. We need managers to be providing ongoing communication and support, obviously promoting health and safety standards and supports. We were talking earlier about the importance of policies, and firstly having appropriate policies, but also promoting those policies. And finally, role modeling positive behaviors. As a manager, I'm really strategic about being authentic and open with my team about my mental health and well-being. Obviously not unloading on them, but if there is a day where maybe I'm feeling a little bit low or low on energy or whatnot, just speaking openly about that to normalize that it's okay to have those discussions. Now, doing something like that is going to increase the likeliness that someone feels safe coming to you if they are having that experience themselves and they need reasonable adjustments put in place. Now, when it comes to our secondary interventions, we need to take early warning signs seriously. There was that comment that I think it was Simon who made earlier where maybe it wasn't Simon. Someone made a comment saying the amount of times that people would be like, oh yeah, they've just been doing that for ages. So we need to take those early warning signs seriously. We need to link employees in with support. So whether it be employee assistance programs, getting an ergonomic assessment, making reasonable adjustments, whatever is appropriate depending on what they're presenting with, we need to try and get those supports in as soon as possible. Obviously making those reasonable adjustments. And if an incident occurs, and I was chatting about this just on the break where I was saying that there's an organization I'm working with who has had an informal claim of bullying and harassment. So no formal claim has been lodged yet. They've approached us and they are proactively trying to investigate that claim before a formal claim even occurs. So they want to understand what has occurred, how do our policies and procedures line up, what support mechanisms have been put in place and have been utilized, and how can we do better. So to me, that's a perfect example of actually investigating incidents in an appropriate manner. And then finally, we've got the tertiary. And to be honest, you probably know a lot about the tertiary stuff already. So things like communicating openly with employees, and that obviously links to if there is an injury or an accident. Be proactively involved in the return to work process. I want you to test out, and this could be maybe one of our practical steps that we take today. For your next claim that you have, see if you can get a manager or a supervisor to a medical case conference. Just see if you can do that. Have that one goal just for one claim to try and get them there, and have a look at the outcome of actually having that physical presence of your manager or supervisor. Modifying tasks to accommodate a return to work, and also monitor and provide ongoing support. So I want to talk to you about a bit of a case study. This is a real life scenario. This is a council that I've been working with. Now, in this scenario, we had one of their head of workplace health and safety approached us and said, we've got this really complex situation with the team. We've got 3 supervisors within the team, none of which are talking to each other. One of them has just returned from a workers' compensation psychological injury, and the team was dysfunctional to the point that they weren't able to have team meetings because the team supervisors refused to be in a room together. All right. So this was an example where I guess it would be more of that tertiary intervention. What we did was we actually interviewed every single member within the team. So not just the team supervisors, but we wanted to know, there were about 15 people in the team. We wanted to know exactly what was going on. So we did 1-hour interviews with every single person. What they spoke about was completely confidential and de-identified. We then did very fancy mumbo jumbo terminology, but we did a thematic analysis. So we used a program to identify the key themes and trends of what was actually occurring within the team. We found that there were 4 key themes. Firstly, there was a lack of communication. Now, these 3 supervisors all reported into one team manager. And what we actually found was that team manager was not effectively communicating both with their supervisors, but also with other team members. We found that there was obviously interpersonal conflict, and we found that the conflict taking place between the 3 supervisors, the manager was walking on eggshells with everyone, okay? They were unwilling to have the conversation with each of them to actually go through their organizational policies and procedures around respectful conduct in the workplace, and they just completely avoided the issue and just decided, well, let's just not do team meetings, and that way, we don't have to deal with the conflict. We found that there was a sense of team division and lack of unity. So no one had actually sat down with these supervisors and helped them understand how there was a domino effect between the different pieces of work that they were working on. So there was a sense of everyone was treading on each other's toes. And finally, we found that there had previously been some organizational change that wasn't very well carried out, and there was a complete absence of leadership within the team. Now, from a return to work perspective, if we were just focusing on the person who was off work, the focus would have been on just resolving the conflict that that person had with the other supervisors. If we actually take a step back, and this is my organizational psychologist hat, we can actually see that the real issue was actually with the team's manager, okay? The person that those 3 people were reporting into, because all of the foundations within the team hadn't been set. And as they were encountering these issues, well, then we found that they weren't actually engaging in effective conflict resolution with everyone involved. Now, I'm not saying that they're only to blame. Obviously, everyone contributed in some way or another, but this just points to the importance of making sure that our managers and supervisors are skilled in some of these principles rather than just letting it fester in the way that it had. In terms of what we did following all of this, we went in and did an initiative called a team alignment. So we got everyone into a room and we actually got them to hash out, excuse my language, their shit. And so far, it's been about 2 months since we've done that. And I've been checking in every 2 weeks just to see how things are going. And it's like it's a completely different team. So how can we upskill our managers and our supervisors? Now, commonly, there's kind of 2 avenues of services we'd be looking at. The one is training. The other one is coaching. Now, there's pros and cons of each of these approaches. Obviously, through training, we're getting everyone into a group. So sometimes it can be a bit more cost effective because you're covering off all individuals at once. I guess the struggle with running training is that sometimes it's not tailored to the individual needs of each unique supervisor or manager who's sitting there. We can also find with training, similar like today, how I was chatting about that we need to ensure that there's actually actions that are embedded, that it's not just a theory that we kind of keep in mind, but that it actually leads to behavioral change. Sometimes we can find with training that doesn't actually happen because there's no accountability for it. On the other side, coaching can be really great because firstly, it's one-on-one, so it's actually tailored towards the individual. It can also be paced out over a series of weeks to really embed that behavioral change. So typically with coaching, we would focus on some set coaching goals, and then we would have homework each week and challenge someone to go away to implement some sort of behavioral change, to come back to evaluate how it went and do that over a series of weeks. Now, being a psychologist, I'm massive on evidence and data. Before today's session, I actually went and had a look, well, which one's more effective? My team and I sat down and we were debating for hours about which one is actually more effective. And what we actually found is that a combination of training paired together with coaching is actually one of the most effective approaches when it comes to upskilling our supervisors and managers. So if you came to me today and you said, Jaydene, following your presentation, we've bought in, we really want to be able to upskill our supervisors and managers. How should we go about it? I would probably recommend running some training over a series of weeks, and in between those sessions, having one-on-one coaching for those individual supervisors and managers. So that way, it's both providing them the group education that they need, but it's also giving them the one-on-one accountability and customization to whatever it is that they need support with, and covering off both bases. Out of interest, raise of hands, who here has run training for their supervisors and managers? What have been the kind of topics that you're running training on? Mental health?
Mental health, general leadership.
Yep.
Talking to people, having meaningful conversations, having difficult conversations.
Yep. How effective has it been?
It's upskilling a lot of people. We're starting from a lowish base where, similar to previous conversation, it's people who are in a position because they're good at managing the work, not leading people.
Yep.
So a lot of them are getting introduced to leading people for the first time, and for someone that scares the hell out of them,
Yep.
having to have a one-on-one conversation so they just don't do it.
Yep.
So it's breaking down that stigma, try and not necessarily full-on role playing, but go through those styles of conversations, case studies, how's it work, how's it not work, and getting them into small peer groups of 3 or 4 that deal with similar types of workforce so they can get that piece.
Brilliant. I love the suggestion of maybe doing some peer groups to create, firstly, accountability that people are actually going away from the training and actually putting the skills into practice. But also it's creating that support mechanism that if they do encounter any challenges with it, that they've actually got some peers to turn to and to say, hey, I'm not quite sure about how to navigate this one. Our LTS on-demand service is a really great place too, that once people have that education, well then if they do encounter any challenges, they're able to call up an expert and actually get some advice or maybe refresh that knowledge or that skill set in terms of applying it to a real life situation. Yeah.
We just had challenges again with the workload, like both sides.
Yep.
Workload, but having that, we did a half-day SLT workshop,
Yep.
So I think it's important to understand the factors that might prevent people from actually embedding that knowledge, because the one-day training really works these days, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And with the micro learning, just to repeat, this wonderful, sorry, what's your name? Omi was describing that they've actually done some micro learning for their senior leadership team. With the micro learning, how was that spaced out? Like, how long was the session and over how many weeks?
Not in a more structured way, but
Yep.
integrating into the existing leadership meetings. So we're carving out 20 minutes of
Yep.
that time. So we're not putting another meeting on top.
Yeah.
And that's been once a quarter across the divisions. We've been, so we're trying to change language and mindset, and that's not going to happen overnight.
Brilliant. So that's almost embedding it into the work culture too, that it's a continuity of discussions around whatever topic it is that you're running it. And I love the idea of doing micro learning, because it's just sometimes with full day training, there's so much information to absorb that we almost forget maybe 99% of the key points and just remember that 1%. Whereas sometimes spreading it out where you just have little short snippets of information can really help that absorption and application. Who here has done coaching in some way or another, whether it be, I guess, an outcome of, earlier we were talking about bullying, harassment, sexual harassment. Often coaching comes about as a result of that. But sometimes there's also the more proactive coaching where it's just, hey, we want to upskill our supervisors or managers. Yeah. How well has that worked? I'll go to someone else. How has it worked for you? Oh, you have it?
I think all the combination of everything we've spoken about is really important. I think the coaching element allows you to, allows the person, so you ask a lot of questions and allows the person to provide input and be part of their own development. And also, going through PowerPoints is not sometimes not going to cut through.
Yeah.
It's about that one time that you give that person the opportunity to tell you what they're not sure about, and then sort of tailor something towards it.
Yeah, it's about them. So I know there's challenges both in terms of time, but also in terms of revenue. These initiatives can be extremely expensive. In terms of return on investment, and if you want to jump on Google later, there's a huge amount of research out there on the return on investment of both organizational training when it's done properly and also coaching. I've got two hypothetical scenarios here. So we've got organization A. Well, actually A and B are the same. They've both got managers with employees with mental health concerns, all right? Organization A chooses not to invest in their manager development, okay? So they're just assuming, let's say the person on their resume were previously in a manager role and they just assume they've been a manager before. They know how to manage an employee with mental health challenges. So there's no proactivity as a result of their absence of training or understanding. There's no proactivity in checking in and supporting the employee. The result of that is the person makes a claim, okay? So this leads to 17 weeks of lost time and around $700,000 for the claim. That's based on industry averages. We've then got organization B, okay? So they've got the same manager with the same employee with mental health difficulties. They choose to invest around $10,000 into a manager development program. I'm not saying that's how much it costs, just for this organization, that's what they chose to invest in it. This led to the manager proactively checking in on the employee and maybe even making some reasonable adjustments for them. That led to 1 week of lost time and no claim. So we can see here the huge difference, big picture. Now the challenge is this: it's hard to actually measure the return on investment because there's no claim to compare it against, all right? So that's the challenge. And I mean, that case study I spoke to you about earlier, there could have been claims that resulted from, that, but due to their investment, maybe there's not now.
Question. We put all of our coordinators, team leaders, managers and that through return to work training.
Yep.
We also have a management development program. But when you're talking about organisational A and you're talking about mental health, and you're giving your examples, I'm sort of having trouble sort of melding it all together Because like we offer generalist training, so I could say, yeah, okay, we do the $10,000, but then we're talking about mental health. So for an organisation, what sort of mental health training for managers would you be recommending?
Yeah. I think it's going to be dependent on their role and kind of the structure of your organization and what would be most appropriate for them. So, perfect example would be obviously a council is complex, okay? So, the training that you provide to maybe your outdoor staff might be very different to the training that you actually provide to your indoor staff. So, the key takeaway I'd say is that it needs to be tailored. So, it shouldn't be a cookie cutter, hey, I just jumped on Google and found this organization who does mental health training. I'd be looking for a training provider that takes the time to understand your people, to understand the unique circumstances with which they're having mental health discussions, and that's really trying to fill the gap that they've got in terms of understanding and action. Does that make sense?
I still don't get it.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. That's okay. I'd rather you do.
I'm sort of saying, okay, we do all the general training,
Yeah.
but what I'd really like to know what sort of mental health training you're talking about, outdoor staff,
Yeah.
etc., and the audiences and things. Can you give me some suggestions about some things that you recommend?
Yeah. So, for example, for me, and I saw their hand up the end. I'll come to you. Oh, 1 minute. Okay. I'll try to answer quickly. I'd be looking at breaking down stigma, for example, if it was, like I'd focus that as the key discussion. No fluffy mumbo jumbo, like really just trying to get to the point of warning signs of mental health conditions, breaking down stigma, and some really simple steps to have the conversation. So, I mean, something like that just off the top of my head. So, look, just to bring it all together, hopefully I've achieved our objectives. So hopefully you know that managers and supervisors are bloody important when it comes to managing a claim. You know that there's various ways that we can go wrong, but there's also reasons as to why we go wrong. And you know that training and coaching can be both really effective tools when it comes to upskilling our supervisors and our managers, and also trying to have some longevity in whatever intervention it is, that it's not just a once-off, hey, here's some education, but you're really embedding it within the organization culture and you're keeping them thinking about and putting these skills into practice. Please come and connect with myself and Brian, who are both here today. I've loved every moment of today, so thank you for your time and all the best.